The house was completely still. It was just past 2 in the morning on January 20th, 1993, and La Paisible, Audrey Hepburn's small manor home in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, sat silent beneath a winter sky. No wind, no movement. The kind of quiet that only comes when the world is holding its breath. Robert Wolders had been sitting beside her bed for hours, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath the way a man counts the seconds between lightning and thunder, hoping the gap never closes. She had been unconscious for most of the evening. The hospice nurse had slipped out of the room minutes earlier. The only light came from a small lamp on the nightstand, casting a warm gold across the white of her sheets, across her face, still impossibly beautiful, even now, even at the very end. Robert did not move. He sat with her hand folded inside both of his, the way he had sat beside her for the past 6 years, steady and unhurried, the quietest kind of love. Then something changed. Audrey's eyes opened, not slowly, not the foggy, half-conscious flutter of someone drifting in and out of sleep, fully, clearly. Her eyes opened the way they always had when she was truly present, when she was paying attention, when she was about to say something that mattered. She turned her head toward him, her lips parted, and in a voice barely above silence, barely more than the movement of air, she whispered something to him. Robert Wolders leaned in close. He heard every word. For a long moment he could not move. His face changed, not into grief, not into the collapse of a man watching someone he loved disappear, but into something harder to name, something that looked almost like peace, breaking open inside him all at once. His eyes filled. He brought her hand slowly to his lips, and he stayed there, unable to speak, holding on. No one else was in the room. No one else heard what she said. For years, Robert would carry those words privately, the way people carry the most sacred things, not hidden exactly, but protected, kept close, given only to silence. But to understand what Audrey whispered to him in that room, and why it stopped him so completely, you have to go back. Not to the hospital, not to the diagnosis. Further than that, back to a woman the world thought it knew, and the life she actually lived. If you have ever sat beside someone you loved and realized there were still things left unsaid, drop a comment below. This story is for you. Audrey Hepburn was not supposed to be an icon. She was supposed to be a survivor. That was the first thing she ever was. Long before the films, long before the elegance, long before the world decided she represented something timeless and unreachable. She was born Audrey Kathleen Rustin on May 4th, 1929, in Brussels, Belgium, the daughter of a British banker and a Dutch baroness. Her childhood moved constantly. Belgium, England, the Netherlands. By the time she was 10 years old, she had already learned that the ground beneath her feet was never guaranteed to hold. Then the war came. In 1940, Nazi forces occupied Arnhem in the Netherlands, where Audrey was living with her mother. She was 11 years old. What followed were 5 years that never fully left her. Years of watching neighbors disappear, of hiding in basements when the trains came through, of going days without food during the Dutch hunger winter of 1944, when the German blockade reduced entire cities to starvation. Audrey was 15 years old and weighed less than 90 pounds by the time Allied forces arrived. She would carry the physical marks of those years for the rest of her life. The fragile frame, the careful relationship with food, the instinct to ration and preserve. But she would also carry something else, a ferocious, unshakable understanding of what actually mattered in a human life. After the war, she pursued ballet in London, then fell into acting almost by accident. One role led to another. By 1953, she was starring in Roman Holiday opposite Gregory Peck, and the world stopped and stared. There was something about her that no camera could fully explain, a quality of presence that felt both luminous and deeply, privately sad. She won the Academy Award that same year. She was 23 years old. The fame that followed was enormous. Sabrina, Funny Face, Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Fair Lady. She became one of the most photographed women on earth, dressed exclusively by Hubert de Givenchy, celebrated in every city she entered. But inside the elegance, inside the photographs, inside the carefully maintained image, Audrey Hepburn was a woman who had survived things the public never fully knew. And she was still, quietly, searching for something the fame had never once provided. She was still searching for a place where she could simply be still. She found stillness, eventually, but not where anyone expected. By the late 1960s, Audrey had stepped back from Hollywood almost entirely. The film offers kept coming. Directors wrote her personal letters. Studios offered her anything she asked for, but she kept saying no. The world assumed it was exhaustion. It was something deeper than that. Her first marriage, to actor and director Mel Ferrer, had collapsed after 14 years. A relationship that people close to her described as quietly suffocating, a partnership where her needs consistently came second. Her second marriage, to Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti, had ended in humiliation. Dotti's affairs were public, repeated, and eventually impossible to ignore. Audrey endured them with the same composure she brought to everything, until she could not anymore. By 1982, that marriage was finished too. 2 marriages, 2 failures, and through both of them, she had done what she always did. She had held herself together beautifully on the outside, while something essential was quietly eroding within. What she wanted, she told close friends, was embarrassingly simple. A garden, her dogs, her sons nearby, mornings without schedules, food cooked slowly in a small kitchen. She had retreated to La Paisible, the old manor house in Tolochonaz she had first bought in 1964, and she had begun, methodically and deliberately, to build the life that fame had always interrupted. She planted roses along the south wall. She grew vegetables. She walked the same path through the same fields every morning, and she let the rhythm of it slowly return her to herself. It was in this quieter life that Robert Wolders appeared. He was Dutch, like her, gentle, like her, a former actor who had spent the last years of his life caring for actress Merle Oberon through her final illness. A man who understood, without needing it explained, what it meant to love someone through their most difficult passage. They met in 1980 through mutual friends. There was no dramatic beginning, no grand gesture. He simply began to be present, and she found that she did not want him to leave. What Robert gave her was something no amount of fame or beauty or professional triumph had ever managed to provide. He saw her, not the icon, not the image, just Audrey. Quiet, complicated, still healing Audrey. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. But peace, for Audrey Hepburn, was never something she could hold on to without giving something back. In 1988, she accepted a role that had nothing to do with acting. UNICEF appointed her as a Goodwill ambassador, and from the moment she said yes, she gave the position everything she had. Not the polished, ribbon-cutting version of charity work that celebrities performed for cameras and then left behind. Real work, field work. She traveled to Ethiopia, to Sudan, to Bangladesh, to Guatemala, to El Salvador, places where children were dying of things that should not kill children in a world with enough resources to prevent it. She held infants in refugee camps. She sat in the dirt beside mothers who had nothing left. She looked directly at suffering that most people in her position would have observed from a careful distance, and she did not look away. Robert went with her everywhere. He carried her bags through airports at midnight. He held her hand on the flights home when she sat in silence for hours, staring at nothing, processing things that could not be processed quickly. He watched her walk into situations that broke her open every single time, and then watched her gather herself, stand up straight, and go back in. He never once asked her to stop. He understood, without her having to explain it, that this work was not separate from who she was. It was the most honest expression of it. A child who had nearly starved in Arnhem was now standing in the places where children were starving now, making sure someone with a recognizable face was bearing witness. But by 1992, the pace had taken everything it could take. She returned from a field mission in Somalia in September of that year, and Robert knew immediately that something was wrong. Not the familiar exhaustion he had learned to read over the years. Something different. Deeper. She was losing weight she could not afford to lose. She was pale in a way that rest did not fix. She told him she was fine. He did not believe her, and he did not pretend to. In November 1992, doctors in Los Angeles found the cancer. Colon cancer. Advanced. already spreading. They operated, and the surgery confirmed what everyone in that room already feared. There was nothing more that medicine could reliably promise her. She listened to the diagnosis quietly. She asked a few careful questions, and then she made the only decision that ever truly mattered to her. She was going home. The flight from Los Angeles to Switzerland took 11 hours. Robert sat beside her the entire way. She slept for most of it, her head resting against the window, her breathing shallow but steady. Somewhere over the Atlantic, she woke briefly and looked out at the darkness below. Nothing visible, just black water and black sky. And then she closed her eyes again without saying anything. Robert watched her and did not sleep. He had not slept properly in weeks. He was operating on something beyond rest, beyond ordinary endurance, the specific, focused energy that comes when you have decided that someone else's comfort matters more than your own exhaustion. When the Alps appeared below them in the early morning light, Audrey opened her eyes. She looked out the window for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "There it is." As if she had been away at war, as if the sight of those mountains returning her to herself was the only medicine that had ever truly worked. Robert reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and neither of them said anything else until they landed. At La Paisible, she moved through her final weeks with a deliberateness that the people around her found both heartbreaking and remarkable. She asked to be taken into the garden every morning, regardless of the cold. She dictated letters to her sons, Sean and Luca, letters she made Robert promise to deliver personally. She asked him to read poetry to her in the evenings, slowly, without rushing, the way she had always loved language best, and gradually, in the way that people sometimes do, when they know time is becoming specific and finite, she began to say the things she had carried quietly for too long. One night, 2 weeks before the end, she told Robert she needed to speak to him. He tried to slow her down. "Rest," he said. "Save your strength." She shook her head with the particular firmness that had always meant the conversation was not optional. "Robert," she said, "I need you to listen. Not tomorrow. Now." She spoke for a long time. She told him what the war years had taken, what the failed marriages had cost her, what she had spent decades trying to outrun, and what, finally, loving him had allowed her to put down. She thanked him, not briefly, not formally, but completely, the way you thank someone when you understand that you are running out of chances to do it properly. Robert listened to every word without interrupting. And then came January 20th, the still house, the lamp, the silence, her eyes opening clearly in the dark, and 4 words, barely more than breath, that broke him open and held him together at exactly the same time. "You saved me, Robert." For a long moment, no one moved. The night held completely still around them, as if the world itself had paused to make room for what had just passed between 2 people in a quiet bedroom in Switzerland. Robert brought her hand to his lips. His shoulders shook once, and then he was still too, sitting beside her in the lamplight, holding on, letting those 4 words settle into the place inside him where he would keep them for the rest of his life. Audrey Hepburn died later that morning. It was 6 o'clock. Her sons were there. Robert was there. She did not struggle. She simply, quietly, stopped. If this story is moving you, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you think those final words meant to Robert. We read every single one. The roses at La Paisible were still blooming. It was January, and by every reasonable measure, they should not have been. The Swiss winter had settled hard over Tolochonaz, the fields gray and frost-covered, the old trees bare against a pale sky. But the roses along the south wall of the house, the ones Audrey had planted herself in the first quiet years of her retreat from Hollywood, were still holding their color. Small, stubborn, beautiful. The gardener who tended them after her death said he had never been able to explain it. He left them exactly as they were. It felt wrong to cut them. Robert Wolders left La Paisible only when he had to. In the weeks that followed Audrey's death, the world mourned loudly and publicly, in the way the world mourns its icons. Tributes in every newspaper, retrospectives on every channel, photographs of her face reproduced across magazine covers in city after city. Gregory Peck, who had loved her since the summer they spent together filming Roman Holiday on the streets of Rome in 1952, wept openly when the news reached him. Hubert de Givenchy, who had dressed her for 40 years, who had built an entire aesthetic around the particular quality of her presence, said simply that fashion had lost its conscience. Heads of state offered condolences. UNICEF released a statement. The letters came in thousands. But inside La Paisible, Robert moved through the rooms quietly, the way a man moves through a space that still holds the shape of someone who is no longer there. Her books on the shelves, her garden boots by the back door, her dogs, confused and patient, still waiting in the places they had always waited for her. Her sons Sean and Luca carried her work forward with a devotion that would have made her proud and probably embarrassed her. Sean wrote a memoir about his mother, honest, careful, deeply loving, in which he described her final weeks not as a tragedy, but as a completion. She had said everything she needed to say, he wrote. She had loved the people she loved without reservation at the end. She left nothing important unspoken. The UNICEF work she had given her last years to did not slow down. The Audrey Hepburn Children's Fund continued, carrying her name into the places she had walked, Ethiopia, Somalia, Bangladesh, long after she was gone. The children she had held in those refugee camps, the mothers she had sat beside in the dirt, became the final and most truthful chapter of a life that had contained more chapters than most people ever knew existed. She had survived a war. She had survived starvation. She had survived 2 marriages that diminished her and emerged from both still recognizably herself. She had stood in the worst places on earth and looked directly at suffering without flinching. And at the very end, in a small bedroom in Switzerland, she had found the words for the thing she had spent 63 years searching for. She had been seen, completely, by one quiet man who never once looked away. There is a certain kind of person who moves through the world giving everything they have to everyone around them, and spends a lifetime struggling to believe that anyone will ever do the same for them in return. Audrey Hepburn was that kind of person. She had fed strangers with her fame and her time and her physical presence in some of the hardest places on earth. She had given her image to a world that consumed it hungrily and asked for more. She had loved people, husbands, children, friends, the children of strangers in refugee camps, with a generosity that never seemed to calculate what it was costing her. And through all of it, beneath all of it, there was a girl from Arnhem who had learned at 11 years old that the things you love can be taken without warning, and who had spent the rest of her life both reaching toward people and quietly bracing for the moment they disappeared. Robert Wolders did not disappear. He stayed. Through the UNICEF missions that hollowed her out, and the diagnoses that frightened her, and the slow, unglamorous work of dying in a body that had already given more than it had to give. He stayed without being asked to stay, without requiring credit for staying, without ever making her feel that his presence was something she needed to earn. And in doing so, in the simple, radical act of remaining, he gave her something that no amount of talent or beauty or worldwide adoration had ever managed to provide. He gave her the experience of being loved without condition, of being held without performance, of mattering to someone not because of what she represented, but because of who she actually was, in the quiet and the ordinary and the difficult. That is what she was thanking him for, in that room, in the dark, with 4 words and what little breath she had left. Not the films, not the legacy, not the icon the world had built around her name. Just that. Just him. Just the irreplaceable gift of someone who looked at her, all of her, the war survivor and the twice-divorced woman and the exhausted UNICEF ambassador and the woman who still got up every morning to walk in her garden and stayed anyway. Audrey Hepburn once said, "The most important thing is to enjoy your life, to be happy. It is all that matters." She spent 63 years learning what that actually meant. And in the end, in the stillness of La Paisible, she found it. Not in the applause, not in the awards, not in the photographs that made her immortal, but in a man sitting quietly beside her bed, holding her hand, refusing to let go. Some people leave the world the same way they lived in it, gently, beautifully, and with more grace than the rest of us will ever fully understand. If Audrey's story moved you today, subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment below. What do you think it felt like for Robert to hear those words in that moment? We read every single comment, and we would love to hear from you.